Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone from wherever you're joining us. Welcome to this webinar on the Global EbA Fund, getting to know the Global EbA Fund. My name is Nora Nguyen. I work with UNEP, managing the project on the Global EbA Fund from the UNEP side and working in close collaboration with my colleagues from IUCN. So I have my fellow panelists here, Julia and Wendy, who will also be speaking in this session. They will introduce themselves as they start off the sessions that they start speaking. So as we welcome you to this webinar, we'd like to request you to put in any questions that you have into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. So there's one written chat and there's one written Q&A. Please insert your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll be monitoring this Q&A section and providing responses directly, and or we'll have them addressed at the end of the session once the major part of the presentation, the substantive part of the presentation is completed. Okay, so I will request my colleague to kindly move to the next slide. So the webinar today is split into two sections. The first substantive section or first substantive component will introduce the structure and the process of the fund. We'll go into the various objectives and the action pillars, the project selection criteria, as well as just provide information on the funding tracks for the fund. As you all know from the communication that's going around this time, it's on indigenous and traditional knowledge. Kindly note that this session is being recorded and the presentation will be made available on the Global EbA Fund website as well as circulated via email. The second part of this webinar today will comprise a Q&A section. This component will not be recorded. It'll provide a platform or an interactive platform for everybody to raise any issues or request any clarifications from the team who are available today to provide responses. Once again, we welcome you to provide your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, and we'll be able to respond to your questions in time. All right, so I will request my colleagues now move to the next slide. So it's my real pleasure to introduce the Global EbA Fund to you all today. So what is the Global EbA Fund? The fund is a catalytic mechanism for supporting innovative approaches to ecosystem-based adaptation with an aim of helping people as well as the environment to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. This fund is funded by the Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of Germany through the renowned ICI, International Climate Initiative. The fund is co-managed and was co-developed and is currently co-managed by two partners, UNEP and IUCN, who utilize their vast and existing extensive networks, tools, as well as expertise in the field of adaptation to tap into this global networks, including FEBA, the Friends of EbA, and the GAN, Global Adaptation Network of UNEP, to build a growing momentum behind nature-based solutions for adaptation or ecosystem-based adaptation. The fund was launched in 2020 and is set to be implemented until June 2028. So far, we've signed up about 28 projects. My colleagues will speak more about this in the first 3 cohorts. Details of these are available on the website, which we will share with you in the chat box after this. Next slide. So why was this fund set up? As mentioned earlier, the fund is a catalytic mechanism for supporting innovative approaches to EbA, ecosystem-based adaptation. It has a really broad thematic focus on innovative approaches to EbA and encourages both creative and catalytic solutions and partnerships in order to create and expand the enabling environment to mainstream and scale up EbA. Next slide, please. But before we move far along, I think it's important for us to understand what EbA is, or what we define EbA as. So the fund uses the definition by CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is, as you can read there in your slides, the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of the overall adaptation strategy to help people to adapt to adverse effects of climate change. This is a general definition that we use as the fund. And I think next slide, this will be the last slide I'll be presenting before handing it over. So UNEP recently released, I think last year in 2022, released a comprehensive report on harnessing nature to build climate resilience, how to scale up the use of ecosystem-based adaptation. This report came about following some extensive consultation and extensive review of key materials. It was undertaken over a period of about a year, and it identified 6 key barriers that are limiting the uptake and scaling up of EBA. These are summarized on your screen, and some of them include lack of knowledge, issues related to governance, issues related to technical capacity, amongst others. We will share this link with you in the chat and would encourage you to look through this report. It's quite a big report, so we do have an executive summary that is available. The executive summary is available in English, French, and Spanish to make it more accessible, and it synthesizes a lot of the information, or at least highlights the key information from the report in the executive summary. So we do welcome you to have a look at this as you look through this, looking to identify which gaps it is that you'd like to address in applying to the fund. From here, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Julia, who will introduce herself and present the next section. Over to you, Julia. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Nora, and hello, everyone. It's great that you're able to join our webinar. My name is Julia. I'm working for the climate change team in the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. And as already mentioned by Nora, IUCN is co-managing the Global EbA Fund together with UNEP. So now that we know what EBA is and the general purpose of the fund, let's focus on the strategic objectives of the fund as well as its action pillars. So overall, within the fund's strategic objectives are trying to kind of define the overall and overarching aim and the direction of the projects, so the what, and the action pillars focus on how this can be reached within the scope of the fund. You can see both the objectives as well as the action pillars on the screen here, and I'll go in more details about each a little bit later. So we're asking all the applicants that are submitting their proposals to the fund to identify a maximum of 1 strategic objective that their project falls under, as well as maximum of 2 action pillars that their project contributes to. So first, starting with the strategic objectives, so the what of the fund. As you can see on the screen, there are 3. The first one, strategic objective 1, is focusing on building awareness and understanding of the critical role of natural assets in underpinning resilience. It focuses on expanding the knowledge and evidence base to help the case of working with people and nature. And it also aims to enhance institutional capacities for mainstreaming EBA international plans and policy frameworks. Strategic objective 2 is focusing on addressing planning and other governance gaps in policy and regulatory environments to increase the attractiveness and feasibility of using and upscaling ecosystem-based approaches for climate change adaptation. And last but not least, strategic objective 3 that focuses on access to finance. So it aims to expand access to sustainable short and long-term finance mechanisms for planning and scaling up ecosystem-based approaches to climate change. Before I move over to the action pillars, of which there are also 3, I would like to mention that within the scope of the fund and within the funding and the duration that we are providing, which is normally projects of around 24 months and of 250,000, but you will hear more about that later. So within understanding this duration and the scope, we must say that the projects should not focus primarily on field implementation in the scope of their proposal. Field interventions are allowed, but they need to be clearly justified and linked to a broader objective, so they cannot be the main purpose of the proposal. We are encouraging projects that focus on creating the enabling environment for the mainstreaming of ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, and the action pillars have been introduced specifically to concretize and to make it more clear what is it that we mean by enabling environment. So now we're going to go in more detail into each of the action pillars. Next slide, please. So here on the screen, you see 3 action pillars. Pillar 1 is levers for catalytic change. Pillar 2 is functional data and science. Pillar 3 is innovation for adaptation. And I will go through each of them with a bit more detail. Pillar 1, levers for catalytic change. Here we need to start with a bit more definitions of what is it that we mean by catalytic intervention and a lever for change. So within the scope of the fund, a catalytic intervention is defined as a targeted intervention that leads to a transformative shift at a systemic level at either global, regional, national, or subnational scale. And within that, a lever for change is defined as an area of work that has the potential to deliver wide-ranging positive change beyond its immediate focus. And some of the examples we've defined as levers for catalytic change are here on the screen. So projects within this pillar can focus on working with policy and policy instruments, and, for example, supporting the inclusion and mainstreaming of ecosystem-based adaptation in national, subnational, and sectoral policies and policy instruments, as well as inclusion of EBA in national determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and other foreign policy frameworks. Projects can focus, for example, supporting the establishment of green public procurement, inclusion of EBA considerations in payment for ecosystem services using building codes, and zoning regulations to support EBA, and so on. The next pillar for next lever for catalytic change that we have identified under this pillar is education, capacity building, and skills development. And here projects can focus on inclusion of EBA into the curricula of formal, informal, and technical and vocational education and training, as well as capacity building and life learning activities that target specifically groups of practitioners that are directly involved in shaping policy and practice, such as, for example, extension workers, agriculturists, city planners, public servants, and so on. Another lever for catalytic change that has been identified under this pillar is financing. And here, projects can focus on developing innovative financing mechanisms, incentivizing public and private partnerships, and so on. And last but not least, another lever here is working through the value chain perspective of a sector or a commodity to define entry points for change and ensure the adoption of EBA, diversify business models, and incentivize private sector collaboration. Some of the examples of activities that projects can focus on here are, for example, working with food processing company that changes its business model to collaborate with producers who adopt ecosystem sensitive practices, or to work on developing a new eco-label or improving an existing eco-label that includes the criteria from EBA considerations, to work with trade or farmer associations that then take into account and promote EBA to its members and encourage capacity building here as well. So under Pillar 1, field implementation to support different work that can be done under Pillar 1 is accepted, but it needs to be clearly justified and it needs to be presented in a broader scope, linking to a broader objective, such as, for example, policy influencing. Moving on to Pillar 2, functional data and science. Here, the work involves taking a data and science-driven approach to promote EBA action. It may involve, for example, extracting information and insights from data to make a case for mainstreaming EBA and informed decision-making. And some of the examples of activities that can be considered here are, for example, undertaking climate risk and vulnerability assessment, developing future scenario modeling, undertaking cost and benefit and multi-criteria analysis, and so on. Of course, here, field implementation to support this work can also be considered, once again, with a clear justification of how it contributes to a broader objective. Under this pillar, it is important to note that projects are also requested to develop means or operational plan for the application, use, and adoption of the information and knowledge they will be developing, they will be generating in order to influence decision-making and prompt the EBA action. So how the knowledge and how the report, for example, produced through this pillar will be then used for decision-making. So it's not just a report that is not referred to and is not applied for strategic decision-making when it comes to ecosystem-based adaptation. Pillar 3, innovation for adaptation. So within the scope of the fund, innovative projects on EBA are defined as the ones that are yet to be proven, or are the initial stages of development, or are yet to be tested in a different context. And this can take the shape of an approach, a process, a practical tool, or an application, for example. And some of the examples that can be considered here under this pillar is projects that focus on developing unconventional partnerships, supporting the integration of EBA into novel sectors, developing innovative tool for EBA implementation, and so on. Field implementation here to pilot an innovative approach is allowed, and it needs to justifying it here can be quite straightforward. So just to recap, when applying, please identify one main strategic objective that your project contributes to, as well as identify a maximum of two pillars that your projects fall under. And this is introduced to encourage the focus and strategic focus of the projects that we are receiving within the scope of the funding that we are giving. And now over to my colleague for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. I was just responding to one of the questions in the Q&A. So as a reminder, please do post your questions in the Q&A, but we can also have introductions in the chat as well. It's nice to meet everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. Very excited to hear the questions that you have and to have a discussion that we're having today. My name is Wendy Atieno. I work within the IUCN climate change team, working on ecosystem-based adaptation, including as part of the EbA Fund Secretariat. So for my section of the presentation, I'll just talk about the fund, what we fund in terms of what the EbA Fund is looking for projects on a, Yulia provided more the thematic focus, where this is just more on an operations level, as well as a bit more discussion on what is EbA. So in terms of what we fund, the EbA Fund is looking for catalytic and innovative projects that help to create an enabling framework for people to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change using ecosystems and ecosystem services. And in terms of definitions of catalytic, we are looking, what do we mean by catalytic? It's a targeted intervention that leads to a transformative shift at a systemic level at either global, regional, national, or subnational scale. And innovative is projects that are ones that are yet to be proven, are at the initial stages of development, or yet to be tested. However, we look to applicants to tell us what is catalytic and what is innovative in their context. And so we want to hear more from you about why you think your project is catalytic and why you think your project is innovative. A second aspect of what we fund is projects that are between 50 and 250,000 US dollars. So the lowest amount that can be funded is 50,000. And between 50 and 250,000 projects don't need any justification. There are instances where you can submit a proposal that's over 250,000 and less than 500,000. In that case, additional justification needs to be provided. However, funding requests cannot go above 500,000. So 50 to 250,000, no problem. You can submit it without any justification. 251,000 to 499,000, you would need additional justification for why the additional funding is needed. The fund also supports projects that are between 0 to 24 months. So it could be maybe a one-time meeting that you're requesting funding for, or a project that's being implemented for up to 24 months. And again, similar to the 50 to 250 window, if it's anything between 1 month to 24 months, my apologies, no justification is needed. However, if you're requesting a duration of time that is more than 24 months, but less than 36 months, additional justification would need to be provided as to why this additional time is needed. And anything more than 36 months is not allowed. A point here as well, because we do get questions about this, is if you want to build in M&E into your project as a way to request more than 24 months, again, think through the context of your project and what is implemented, and we look to you to provide further justification about whether or not this is needed. Do also note, as my colleague Nora mentioned, that the fund will go on until 2028. And so our intention as well during this time is to also monitor impact. The fund also looks to fund, project can be global, thematic, or targeted to an ODA eligible country or more than one ODA eligible country. So in the case that they are global, they're not targeted to any specific country. Similar with thematic, it could be pursuing a particular theme and not necessarily targeted to any country. However, if it is targeted to a country, it must be an ODA eligible country at the time of application. And so the list is updated every year, and we do provide that link. So do, as you're applying, double check that the country that you're proposing the intervention for is ODA eligible. And finally, projects need to contribute to an enabling environment for the implementation of EBA and need to align with the FEBA EBA qualification criteria and quality standards. Excuse me. So here, in terms of contributing to an enabling environment for the implementation of EBA, one thing that is important to recognize is because the fund is for a very short duration of time, so 24 months, even going up to 36 months, is not enough time to be able to demonstrate impact when you're working at the field level. So if you're implementing a restoration project or conservation or sustainably managing directly the ecosystems, you will need up to 10 years and more in order to actually see the benefits. And so when you're proposing a project that has field implementation, really think about, are we able to demonstrate impact in the time that is allocated? And so why we emphasize contributing to an enabling environment for the implementation of EBA is projects can work to support the implementation of EBA. They don't have to directly be implementing, but can complement the work of implementation. So as my colleague Julia had presented with the pillars as well, right? Is it a policy change? Is it a communication change? What are you looking to implement that will strengthen the environment for the implementation of EBA? And in the next slide, then I'll talk about the EBA qualification criteria and quality standards more in depth. So EBA has 5 criteria and 3 elements. These 3 elements are that it helps people adapt to climate change, that EBA makes active use of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and that EBA is part of an overall adaptation strategy. So with this last element, EBA is not a standalone intervention. It has to be working in concert with other adaptation strategies. So think about the existing policy context, but I'll come back to this a bit more. So in terms of element A and criterion 1, EBA reduces social and environmental vulnerabilities in the context of climate change. And criterion 2, that it generates societal benefits in the context of climate change. So you're looking here at helping people adapt to climate change. Who's benefiting, who's most vulnerable, and how can the intervention help address these questions? Excuse me. Criterion 3 is about ecosystem health in the sense that EBA restores, maintains, and improves ecosystem health. So we have to be able to see how your intervention targets biodiversity gain. And this is one where that seems a little bit contradictory when we say we are deprioritizing field implementation, but really it's how does your intervention contribute to the restoration, maintaining and improvement of ecosystem health. So you need to be able to articulate that. And on the third element with the last 2 criteria, you have criterion 4 is supported by policies at multiple levels. So you're looking at the global level, national level, subnational level, and regional, if you're looking at regional bodies as well. What is a policy environment for EBA? How can we make EBA more sustainable? And how can we mainstream the approach? And for criterion 5 is that EBA supports equitable governance and enhances capacities. So on the question of governance, who is making decisions about the EBA measure? Who is being involved in the development of an EBA measure? Who's being consulted? And who are the stakeholders? Those are the questions that we need to ask. And then speaking back to the mainstreaming and sustainability aspect of working in EBA is that you're enhancing the capacities of all who are involved. So whether it's your national stakeholders or your local level stakeholders, you need to be able to demonstrate this. One thing to flag here as well, when we're talking about EBA, and just to give you a few more definitions, is that what EBA is looking at is adaptation. It's the adaptation piece of the climate change, addressing climate change. So in this case, we need to make a distinction between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, where mitigation, and I'm sure most of you know this, but it is worth repeating, climate mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gases that result in climate change, or it's to increase the methods to absorb the gases. While climate adaptation is responding to the impacts that are already happening. So what we're looking to see is projects that then target specific climate impacts, including droughts, floods, extreme heat, storm surges, and so on and so forth. Mitigation can be a co-benefit of the intervention that is proposed, but it should not be the primary objective. The primary objective should be adaptation. Another thing to remember is, as I mentioned with the 3 elements, is that EBA needs to balance ecosystem health, it needs to balance climate adaptation, and it needs to balance benefits to people. So for example, if you're working to conserve, restore, or sustainably manage ecosystems, but do not link this to helping people adapt to climate impacts, that's not an EBA project. That could be a restoration project, it could be a conservation project, but without demonstrating how conservation of ecosystems will help people adapt to climate change, or restoration of a certain ecosystem is going to help people adapt to climate change, without that link, that's not EBA. Another example is if you're working to strengthen community livelihoods and increase resilience through the strengthened livelihoods, but without demonstrating a link to ecosystem health, this is also not EBA. This would be considered a development project, for example. And so you need to be able to show how ecosystem health will result in, or will link to strengthening community livelihoods. So again, thinking and helping people adapt to climate change. So really just balancing these 3 elements is very important. And following this, I will pass it off to my colleague. Oh, my apologies. Sorry, this is still me. So yes, more about the recipients of the fund. So talked about what we fund. Now this is more a question of who we fund. So the EBA fund prioritizes applicants that are well-grounded in the proposed area of work. So you need to be able to demonstrate expertise and experience in whatever area of work that you're proposing for the proposal. And this can also be demonstrated in your consortium partners. So if it's One Health proposal, for example, demonstrating that link for ecosystem health, who's got the capacity for that, who has a capacity for human health, who has the capacity for climate change adaptation, who has a capacity for EBA. So this really needs to stand out in the application, whether it's within one organization or within the consortium partners. Applicants need to have experience of the size and type of project proposed. So the second part of this links back to the previous point that they need to be well-grounded in the proposed area of work, but also you need to demonstrate experience in the size. So if you were requesting 250,000, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have managed budgets of 250,000 in the past or even more. If you have not had, have not been able to manage budgets of 250,000 before, consider applying for a lower funding envelope. Again, the minimum that you can apply for is 50,000. So think about how you can build towards 250,000. Projects need to be inclusive, or applicants rather, need to be inclusive of local communities, indigenous knowledge, and gender perspectives. And here, whether you're applying for the general track or the thematic track, we need to be able to see inclusion of relevant stakeholders given your context. For those who are applying through the thematic track, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and then you'll be able to pull out, to be able to show a little bit more of this. And then the last point is that we want to see applicants who are partnering with local organizations. So CBOs, local NGOs, if it's a big INGO, if it's an international organization, if it's a global organization, how are you working with people who are in the area? How are you also, a question of strengthening capacities, how are you transferring knowledge? How are you integrating perspectives? And how is that exchange back and forth working within your consortium? Next slide, please. The other operational aspects of this question is that applicants need to be legally recognized entities to be eligible. So you need to be able to show your legal status, whether it's through an MOU, articles of incorporation, certificate of registration, whatever it is within your context, that is the document that gives you legal status. And this changes from country to country. And we also need to see local NGOs. So in terms of this, all kinds of organizations are welcome to apply, whether it's local NGOs or INGOs with relevant EBA experience and local presence, community-based organizations, research organizations, think tanks, academic institutions, vulnerable communities and indigenous peoples organizations, private sector companies. It's a wide breadth of organizations that are welcome to apply to the EBA fund. There are two exceptions to this. The first being UNEP and IUCN offices who are excluded from applying because this would be a conflict of interest. And then the second one is government agencies who cannot receive funding from the EBA fund. However, both of these exceptions can be part of a proposal, working to implement, working to support, working to develop a proposal. This is absolutely welcome for UNEP and IUCN offices and for government agencies. The only thing is that they would not be able to receive funding from the fund. Next slide, please. All right, and so then I'll pass it off to my colleague, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And now we are moving to the part of the webinar where we talk about how to apply. So there are some changes that we are introducing here, and I will talk through them in this part of the webinar. As some of you probably know, in the beginning of 2023, we have already introduced some changes and we shifted to a one-stage application process where a full proposal is required to be submitted right away. As we are continuing to improve the fund, we are introducing further additions and further improvement to our processes. And moving forward, all applications will need to be submitted through an online platform that will be launched shortly. It's not up and live yet, but it will be so very, very soon. Application documents, as well as the supporting documents that we require, remain all the same as they used to be. The only difference is that they now would need to be uploaded online and filled out online through this online platform that is now structured in 3 sections that you can see on the screen. So there is the first section dedicated to eligibility screening, second to due diligence and financial capacity, and third is application form, which is the main body of your proposal. Basically, these are all the same documents that were there before. They're just put on the online platform and structured in these 3 sections. Shortly after I'm done with the presentation, we will share the link with you where you can find all the templates of each of the 3 sections and further guidance on how to move ahead with your proposal. So going to section 1, eligibility screening. This is basically a questionnaire that allows us to do the initial screening of eligibility of your proposal, and it's based on all the criteria and all the descriptions that we've provided you so far in this webinar. You can also find it on our website and in the grants procedures manual, and we will share the link shortly. There you will be asked to answer multiple choice questions as well as provide additional explanation and elaborations where applicable. There are no supporting documents that need to be attached in this first eligibility screening section. The second section is dedicated to due diligence and financial capacity questionnaire, and its template you can also find online on our website. Please here pay specific attention to the supporting documents that are requested and will need to be uploaded. You will need to upload them on the online platform once you fill out the questionnaire. Such documents as, for example, the confirmation of the legal registration of the main applicant organization as well as the partner organizations will be required, audited financial statements, and so on. Those kind of documents you will need to upload in support of the questions that you will be answering in the due diligence and financial capacity questionnaire. And section 3 is application form. And as I've mentioned before, it is basically the main body of your proposal. And here again, please pay specific attention to the documents that you will ask to be uploaded. And mainly here, these documents are the CVs of the core project team, so that we can see that there's capacity in the team to implement the activities that are requested, as well as any other supporting documents that you would like to attach to support your proposal. It can be a baseline study or anything like that. Detailed budget is a component of the application form, and it needs to be developed offline and then uploaded as an attachment in the application form. There is a template for the detailed budget as well as the detailed guidance in the template of the form. We will share this, of course, as anything else. Please note that it's also compulsory to attach the signed applicant declaration form. And if you have co-applicants from the project consortia, there's also a co-applicant mandate that should be signed. And these are the documents that you would need to upload in the application form section of the online platform. So documents in all the three sections would need to be submitted in English, and official translation is not required. It can be unofficial. So it is essential that at least the legal status, the documents confirming your legal status, are translated in English, and those that underline the auditor's opinion of the audit documents of your organization. So once again, the official translations are not required. So as I mentioned in the beginning, online platform is not live yet. We just want to introduce it in this webinar, and this will be the way to apply moving forward, including this current cohort, which cuts off on the 15th of September. We will shortly be announcing its launch, but while you prepare your documents, please do that offline, and you will just eventually have to copy paste everything that you are developing to the online platform. All the templates are available and all the guidance is there. We will share the link here. We have also introduced new guidelines to the development of the logical framework, as well as detailed activity table for your project, which is a very core and one of the main components of your proposal. So projects must have one overarching outcome, only one, and around 2 to 3 outputs. We allow maximum 4, but we encourage and strongly recommend to develop 2 to 3 outputs, and then each output will have a maximum of 5 activities. This is introduced to ensure a very focused and strategic projects that can be achieved, can be implemented within the scope of funding that we are offering. All this information and all this guidance is available on our website, as well as in the grants procedures manual that we will be sharing in the chat. Next slide, please. So here on the slide, you can see a sort of a checklist of what to consider before applying, and it's a summary of things that we have presented so far. So to try to understand whether the project is eligible, whether the concept that you have in mind is actually in line with the goals and objectives of the Global EbA Fund, as well as other criteria that we employ, you can go through this checklist that is also available on our website. And things that you would consider are, for example, does my project qualify as ecosystem-based adaptation? So here you would look into the qualification criteria that my colleague Wendy has just described, that were developed by Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Network, FEBA. Another question you might consider is, does my project have a catalytic and innovative potential to create enabling environment for EBA? And we've provided you with the definitions of what this means within the fund. Does my project clearly identify the climate impacts it is aiming to address, and clearly describes how they will be addressed through the activities that I'm proposing? Does the project contribute to one strategic objective and maximum 2 pillars of the fund? If the project is at a national or multi-country level, are the countries targeted ODA eligible? Is my project between 50,000 and 250,000? If I'm requesting more funding up to 500,000, can I provide an adequate justification? The same goes for the duration. Is my project up to 24 months or less? If it's between 24 and 36 months, can I provide an adequate justification of why a longer duration is required? Does my project add value or upscale existing work? Does my project clearly demonstrates how a result will be maintained and developed after the funding period? Does my project partner with local institutions or organizations in cases where this is applicable? Are the lead applicant and partner organizations well-rounded and have the knowledge in the proposed areas of work? Are the lead applicant and partner organization legally recognized entities? And does the main applicant to the fund comply with due diligence requirements of the Global EbA Fund? All this information you can, as I mentioned before, find on our website, and we'll share the supporting links in the chat.